All right, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to uphold birthright citizenship, the traditional sense of it. And the left likes it, the right doesn't. 6-3 overall, but truly 5-4 as Kavanaugh upheld it due to a federal law, not necessarily from the Constitution. And which is, of course, is easier to change than an amendment. He did the Trump special where they say, you went about this wrong, but here's how you could do it, because Trump is dictatorial and no, with no legal background, and does the whole Michael Scott I declare bankruptcy meme for his major moves. Before we talk actual birthright, the meta law here is important to mention. And basically, it's, can a president issue an executive order that supersedes the Constitution? So we're not necessarily talking directly about this. We're talking about philosophy for future presidents. Can a president say no more guns because we have too much violence? It can topple the government. Innocent people get killed. That's a reasonable argument that most countries successfully made. That's why they don't have guns everywhere. And then you'll often, as the same point of like, well, many countries don't have birthright citizenship. It's the logical choice. Okay, is it the logical choice to not do guns? So that's the true implication here, the wider war versus just this battle. This ruling would provide evidence and precedent that presidents cannot alter the Constitution because they signed a piece of paper at their desk to benefit whatever ideological bent they possess that week. So if we're going to talk birthright citizenship, let's read the sentence at play. And it's, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, end quote. Now, of course, philosophers masquerading as lawyers that play with words will, what really is jurisdiction or something like that. But come on, if we just look at this with common sense, read plainly, it's clear what it means. If you're here at the time of birth, you're an American citizen, whether that makes sense or not in practice. The American Constitution is normal thinking to us since we grew up with it. We've been exposed to it. It's our mode of thought. But it's inherently a radical revolutionary document. It's not necessarily built on pure practicality. Anyone can say what they want. That's pretty insane, even in bad faith, even if it's proven lies you're saying. But we did take some pragmatic approaches, I guess, to the First Amendment as well. You can't yell fire if there isn't one. You can't use your free speech to forge documents to steal from a bank. You can't directly call for a violent overthrow of the government. You can't exercise free speech to perjure yourself in a courtroom. Let's look at number 2. Anyone has a right to bear arms. And that's been interpreted practically that you can't own certain arms, actually. You can't if you're a toddler, you can't if you're a felon, or even worse, like a felonious toddler. And it's no shit people can't be trusted to own nukes, but the amendment didn't really account for that. It says plainly we could, I guess, so now what? The birthright clause is remarkably plain English, if you're just reading for that. But we have in fact used tricks of the trade to put limits on these other amendments. We just talked about them. Could you not do the same here? A Second Amendment activist, a real gun guy, will state how plain the language of the Second Amendment is. Shall not be infringed, right? But that same guy will often search for the nuance in plainly stated birthright citizenship. The inverse is true as well, where someone seeking to limit the Second Amendment, no guns, will argue the newer context of gun culture and things have changed, while in turn denying the plain language of the Second Amendment. So both will continue to suffer from their dissonance, not quite understanding this Constitution isn't inherently practical. Its logic is broadly, how do we keep citizens' rights against a tyrannical government? But the world isn't set up for abstract concepts such as rights. You're not going to run into a right in the wild. But you can try to decide, do you want to interpret things a little bit looser, take in the nuance and the context and all of that, or do you just want the plain text? And I can switch back and forth depending on if I got my breakfast or not. So I'm not like above this or hovering above this problem. I'm definitely more xenophobic without my waffles, undoubtedly. But I try to understand this governing dilemma in a society built on this unique belief set. At some level, we're all full of shit, presenting either this pragmatic or rational approach, or we'll go with emotional pleas based on whatever one, frankly, is more effective in getting us what we want. And let's read it one more time. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Why is that such a clear statement? It is clear, but of course the context does contain nuance because nuance is one of those features of reality. And you can thank bad faith racists for bringing this about as they imported slaves, extracted their labor, and then after abolition barred them as citizens after their financial use was no longer of need. So this law was directly tied to those men. I've heard people say, really it's about all people, and yeah, it ultimately ends up being that, but it's a direct reaction to, are we going to integrate these slaves or keep them in this purgatory? The plain language was intentional here, so no questions could arise, no crack for those dirtbag slave owners to wiggle through and try to work around. But now that plain language applies in a totally different context as the times have changed. So a law to protect former slaves who immigrated through being kidnapped, essentially, now applies so broadly as to mean anyone from any country here legally or illegally being born on U.S. soil is now granted automatic U.S. citizenship. And we're not the only country with this broad law, as I've heard all the anti-immigrationists say, U.S. is the only one that does it. It's just not true. Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, a lot more of these countries in the Americas, Central, North, South, all of them, not all of them, but most of them practice this. And it was mostly to strip old colonial powers of their future right to the land and to increase population to help build whatever that new nation was. Basing citizenship on bloodlines or ethnicity risked creating permanent underclasses, meaning that you could just have a rich, in Mexico, a rich Spanish family that's been there for a few generations, and now they have unlimited non-citizen labor to exploit. So the native Mexican needed the same rights as the Spanish aristocrat. America looked to avoid something similar, where we had a huge population of former slaves who would essentially be stateless workers at the whim of any employer and politician with no recourse for any abuses. Citizenship is the right to have rights, as Justice Roberts stated. The rich can't just import cheap labor and do with it as it pleases, in theory, even though frankly that's happening constantly right now today all over the US, but at least the aim was noble, right? And of course, the past isn't the past, it's the foundation of your country. But also, it doesn't mean you must always stick to tradition for the sake of it. A mixed system appears more practical, frankly, on this specific issue. Though many nations have a broad view of this, we named a few, many go about it differently, and it's not a crazy way to do it. For instance, you might need a single parent at least being a citizen, a parent that has a minimum time in that country prior, maybe even only a permanent resident, or simply just apply through application for citizenship, or a set period of time the child needs to live in the country, like once the child is 8, they can become a citizen, something like that, something to try to avoid the obvious problem of, someone flies in, has the baby, flies out with no other ties. That is a legitimate weird thing that's allowed. So these do make practical sense, but often the right, if it's left unbalanced, becomes really like ham-fisted here and uses phrases like all immigrants must go and that elimination of nuance. Though they do search for nuance of birthright citizenship clauses, here they don't have as much nuance. It's just as silly sounding as the fly here for a day, have a baby, and leave, and you've got a U.S. citizen. Somewhere in the middle, I know it's not fun to say, everyone wants to be super cool and, communist now, or super cool and fascist, but it's always in the middle, unfortunately. But this hard right thinking will naturally lead through that radicalization process to tracing a legal lineage. And now an illegal great-grandparent renders a whole line of citizens illegitimate who have lived here for decades or, since the 1800s or whatever. And of course, that wouldn't likely be used to target, quote-unquote acceptable European descent. But it's a useful tool against countries the administration at the time doesn't favor, which, let's be honest, would be highly likely to be black or brown people. Or even if you politically fall out of favor, even regardless of race, it says here your Irish grandfather spelled his name wrong on the immigration document because he was illiterate, but really we take that as he was being deceptive. And even though, your family's been here since 1889, you have been talking a lot of shit about the government. So back to Cork, Ireland for you. Also, a lot of this anti-immigration stuff is, it's wonderful on your tweets, but the optics of the actual implementation of getting everyone out, it's not an effective strategy. What are you're gonna police pregnant mothers and put infants through court processes, detention facilities, and flights home? And somebody's yeah, dude, based. But the reality is that's hard to stomach for the wider population. Need to get a little bit more realistic. They could even like it on paper, but they sure don't like to see it in action on video. It's kind of the same effect we see with, slaughterhouses for our food supply. Like, I like the steak, but I don't want to see how it comes about. And then if you don't see how it comes about, then it's just the government working to censor what's going on. So either way of that is not fun. And ultimately, having a reasonable approach requires having reasonable people to conduct that approach. We lack that currently because day by day, our electorate, our leaders, they become more ideological, more performative, right? So instead, blatant, plain language, everyone born here is a citizen, even though we can all see the potential issues from this, ends up being the choice, apparently. Because once you wade into that gray, the ideologues use that fog to enact their pet theory and almost always clashes with the reality of implementation. Across the board, birthright citizenship doesn't make a ton of sense to me. It would have to be something where you had some tie to the country, or at least close the loophole of, fly in, fly out stuff. Of course, I'm not so big on it, but of course there is some national security stuff there, I guess. If you want to go deep in, like, do we have a bunch of Welsh sleeper agents just waiting to activate? Probably not, but still, it is a weird idea. But the amendment's very plain. And once you start introducing some of that nuance that I think is valuable, you're going to have the bad faith group that comes in and, like I said, tracing people back to the 1800s, trying to get people kicked out. So really, I think the answer here for the right, at least, is you need to actually codify some things into law and you need to implement it, right? It can't just be the president doing the I declare bankruptcy meme on Truth Social, right? You're going to actually have to legislate, and to legislate, you generally need to be bipartisan. So you have to knock it off with the constant demonization while you're in control. And most countries do this. They have some poorer country that comes in illegally to be an underclass, to be cheap labor. So until you're going to confront the restaurant, hotel, construction industry, which you're not, because those rich guys are employing our government, our lawmakers, until you say that we're going to go after the actual people paying for this, there's really not much to do here. It's just everybody signaling and counter signaling on social media. So instead, we'll kind of get this waiting game where people get more radicalized on both sides. Having a birthright citizen law that really isn't defensible when you look at it by the numbers, but also totally understand the left's want to make it that plain. So I don't know, man. Very fun. America's very fun right now. Really love it. I'd like if you guys subscribe. That'd be nice. Also, put your comments. Whether you're right or left on this, just let me know what makes sense, what doesn't. I would say we could try to figure it out and solve it together, but Supreme Court said what it said, so it seems like the law of the land going forward.